Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile discussion. We are currently, as I'm recording this, about 36 hours before the patch notes are expected to drop for patch 3.25. What I wanted to do is take a look at some of the highest performing builds of 3.24. Not long-term builds, not end-of-the-league builds, but things that worked really well in the early days of this league, so that you can have your eyes on these builds when you're reading through the patch notes. That you can then say, okay, this build got gutted, this build survived the nerfs, this build got boosted, and then you can make an informed decision amongst a bunch of tried and tested builds. There's not going to be an absolutely comprehensive list of everything that you could conceivably play, but I do think this is a good starting point for potential league starter ideas for patch 3.25 and the Settlers of Kalguur expansion. Now, this was a league that had pretty high build diversity, and the one thing that came close as a bit of a breakout from that, the most popular build of the league, was the cast on critical strike Detonate Dead Inquisitor. This used the transfigured version of Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction, and it used Lancing Steel of Spraying. The way it works is that Lancing Steel of Spraying is used to inflict a lot of hits on enemies. Many of these will be critical strikes because your build invests heavily in crit, and when they critically strike, they trigger two payloads. The first one is Desecrate, which spawns corpses at the enemy's feet. The second one is Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction, which causes those corpses to explode, causing discomfort and problems for the monsters standing above them. One of the key strengths of this build is that it has basically no reliance on its gear for dealing damage early on. Where a lot of other builds that are in this discussion will end up doing twice, 3 times, 5 times as much damage with a good weapon as a dumpster tier one, this build gets started based on much less than that. All you really need is a high critical strike chance foil that has one mod on it, and that is increased local critical strike chance. There are of course things you can get that will make it better, but this build does not require much at all to get going, and it's something that you can invest in and take it far enough to do tier 17s, to do the feared, and to do Uber Pinnacle bosses if you want. Now, it's my opinion that if this build isn't gutted by the patch notes in some way, then you should seriously consider starting it if the playstyle looks fun at all. The most likely nerf it would suffer would be if either Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction suffers a nerf, and if that nerf is substantial, then that could kill the build entirely, or if Lancing Steel of Spraying loses some of the projectiles that it fires, which is probably more survivable, but is still going to be bad news for this build. You need to level this build as something else. This is a build that doesn't come into its own until you get yourself a 5-link and both of the transfigured gems, and those transfigured gems will be in hot demand. Additionally, Lancing Steel of Spraying kind of needs to either be 20 quality or gem level 13, ideally both, but at least one of those two needs to be true in order for the build to feel smooth. Although I will say that leveling it to 13 is a very quick process. It should only take you 10 to 15 maps once you acquire the gem. Now, the links that you'll use for this for your primary damage, Lancing Steel of Spraying, which is then going to link to Cast on Critical Strike, which will trigger both Desecrate and Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction, and also you'll want to have this supported by increased critical strike chance. This is the core functionality, and then after this, the most commonly used 6th gem is increased critical damage, but there are certainly other options that can be considered as well. One drawback to this build, a lot of its damage comes from Spectre micromanagement, which is not particularly fun. You will need to have some sort of Spectre bank in order to optimize this build. It's not that the build is unplayable without optimum Spectres, just that it is a lot less effective. The second most popular build early in 3.24 is also Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction, but it's a very different build. This is the critical strike, instant application damage, necromancer version of the Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction build. So this self-cast Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction uses this in order to do a huge amount of damage. This does a lot more damage than the previous build, but it is a lot clunky to play. I don't recommend playing this lightly. This is the sort of build that a lot of people play because it's powerful rather than because they enjoy it, but if detonating corpses sounds like fun to you, then it is something to keep on your radar. I do think, however, that this is fairly likely to get hit by nerfs. Ultimately, it doesn't scale very much with gear, and it performs ridiculously well in the first 16 hours of a league, and that's why I think that Grinding Gear Games will probably say they'd rather have a meta where builds scale more with gear and make more incremental upgrades than they do on these sorts of Detonate Dead builds. Alright, so Detonate Dead builds out of the way, let's talk now about the Archmage Hierophant. There's a lot of different builds in one, and it was one of the highest performing builds, in fact it was the third highest performing build in the solo self-found Necropolis expansion, as well as a good performer in trade. There's multiple different ways you can build this. Ice Nova of Frostbolts is the strongest version of this going into 3.25's patch notes, although that gem definitely does have some potential to get rebalanced. The other things I'd suggest that you keep your eye on here are both Classic Ball Lightning and Ball Lightning of Orbiting. Both of these are really strong builds, and one of the builds that we'll discuss later when we talk about builds that performed really well in a recent race event that was held was something that was a ball lightning of orbiting Archmage, and it had phenomenal damage, by far the best damage of anything that was playing in that race. So much so that it was able to steal second place, despite the ultimate third place winner entering the Maven when the second place build was still running their final Shaper. So they had to run Shaper, then they had to run Uber Elder, then they had to run the Maven in order to finish the race. And they finished the Shaper, completed the entirety of the Uber Elder encounter and the entirety of the Maven encounter during the time it took the Boneshatter player to kill the Maven. If you want something a bit more hipster though, one of the things that I will be linking to in the description of this video is a playthrough video where someone's done a 3 voidstone run using Crackling Lance as their skill in conjunction with the Archmage Hierophant setup. This is something that performed adequately in their opinion. It wasn't as strong as Ice Nova of Frostbolts, but it was certainly a solid performer, and something that's definitely interesting if you're looking for something tried and tested, but not quite at the center of the matter next league. The fourth suggestion is going to be Righteous Fire. This was hugely popular in 3.24. It had a real resurgence. After 3.23, the gem got nerfed a bit. The build was still good, but people tend to avoid a build that's just been nerfed, but it was still very much good enough to play, and 3.24 saw a lot of people going back to it. Chieftain has become the dominant way to play Righteous Fire now. The On-Death Hinekora explosion procs are just really good with a small investment into Ignite, so you get 100% chance to Ignite, you get one source of proliferation on the build, and then sometimes when you kill one monster, you don't just kill that monster, but you wipe out the entire screen as well. This ends up being really strong, even though the proc rate is only 5%. Now I will say that despite me trying to make armor work as a defensive layer on this build, I will definitely, if I decide to play Righteous Fire Chieftain again next league, I will definitely be joining the herd and jumping over to the physical damage taken as element setup instead. It's just stronger at the moment. It's more reliable because armor is really good until at one moment when it's not, because a monster has 30% physical overwhelm and you're not expecting it and there's no telegraphing of that. You just go splat because suddenly your primary defensive layer doesn't work, and as a result I would advocate using Cloak of Flame in this setup. If you're not familiar with Righteous Fire, Pox has a phenomenal guide to it. And keep in mind that with Righteous Fire, it's not fundamentally a build that is all about dealing damage with Righteous Fire. It will usually use Fire Trap as auxiliary damage. You can use other things instead if you want, but Fire Trap is generally the best of them. And this will actually be the main thing that will be doing heavy damage to single targets. In 5th position is a build that stayed unchanged for a long time. This is the Explosive Arrow Ballista Ignite builds. There are some definite drawbacks to this build. It's incredibly strong, and it's really good at having a safe playstyle for killing bosses. But it does have a very annoying drawback, and that drawback is that you will be killing monsters behind you all the time. If you can live with that, you get a lot of power out of this build, and that's why it was the 5th most popular build early in 3.24 in solo self-found, and why I expect that if there's no major changes, it will continue to be a good choice in patch 3.25. And number 6 was BAMA, the Blink Arrow Mirror Arrow builds that primarily focus on dealing damage through the use of Blink Arrow of Bombarding Clones. This is one of the more easily self-compiled builds that uses Transfigured Gems because it's very easy to get 20 quality versions of your main gems through the use of the Doppelganger Divination card. This will then help you get 20 quality versions of base Mirror Arrow, which can then be turned into base Blink Arrow through the use of the recipe that turns Blink Arrow into Mirror Arrow and vice versa. And that recipe will preserve transfigured status of these gems as well. So if you have Blink Arrow Bombarding Clones and you use this recipe, it'll become Mirror Arrow Bombarding Clones in case you happen to want that gem. This is a really, really strong build, but it's also something fairly complex, but it's also something that I could see ending up copying a few nerfs, because at the very, very top end of play, particularly in conjunction with a dedicated aura-based support character, this build is ridiculously powerful. The other builds that rounded out the top 14 last league were Lightning Arrow, which I think is a very strong choice. There's also Elemental Hit of the Spectrum, which is essentially the same build, and there's Ice Shot, which is essentially the same build. In 3.24, Lightning Arrow, Elemental Hit of the Spectrum were probably about equal in power, and Ice Shot a little bit lower, but who knows what they'll be like in 3.25. One thing I will say though about Lightning Arrow, and really any other attack-based builds as well, is that it's going to be a lot harder to get a good weapon in 3.25, now that we know for absolute certain that the Necropolis mechanics are not going core. The 8th most popular build was the last of the Detonate Dead builds. This is another build that I think has a reasonably high chance of getting nerfed. Detonate Dead, again, just doesn't scale with character gear very much, and this is the Ignite version, which plays quite differently to the other two, even though it uses the same fundamental skill. It's one of the most powerful builds for killing early bosses, but it's also something that requires a fair bit of game knowledge and also a fair bit of messing around with the annoying Spectre mechanics. Other builds you want to keep your eye on are Explosive Trap of Shrapnel, which is something that's also very good at taking out bosses early in the game. Boneshatter, which is something that came third in a recent high-profile race that we'll come to in a sec. Splitting Steel, which is played in a few different ways, and is definitely a very, very viable, even strong skill. Dual Strike of Ambidexterity, which is definitely something to watch with all of the talk about melee going on in 3.25. So that's something that if there are broad-based melee buffs, Dual Strike of Ambidexterity could gain a tremendous amount out of it, and it's already one of the best melee skills in the game. And then the final build that performed really well early on in the league was Exsanguinate Mines. Now, while we've been talking about builds that performed well in the solo self-found version of PathOfExile, one that is a Trade League only build, or at least optimized for Trade League, but that is a really good starter, assuming that it dodges all of the nerf bats, is the Hexblast Mines build. This is incredibly good in Sanctum content. It's good everywhere, but it's ridiculously good at Sanctum, and it's also very good at farming its own best-in-slot helmet, the Sandstorm Visage. So definitely keep this one in mind. If there is no change to the interaction between Curse on Hit Rings, Hexblast, and Mines, then this is a build that you definitely want to consider in patch 3.25. Now, I mentioned that there was a high-profile race that took place a few days ago. Jungroan's a streamer who does a lot of racing content and has put together a number of builds that he's run from very start of the game all the way up to 2, 3, or 4 voidstones. He organised a race where the goal was to get 4 voidstones, but in a hardcore solo self-found environment. Now, this was with the Necropolis mechanics in play, which both meant that mapping was a bit more dangerous than it is in the normal game, but also meant that gear was stronger than it would be in the normal game. I want to point that out when we talk about some of these builds, because one of the builds, the one that had by far the best damage, also had gear that I don't think is particularly realistic for day 1 in patch 3.25. That said, the winner was Summon Raging Spirit's Guardian, which completed a 4 Voidstone tour with the hardcore and the solo self-found hard mode rule sets in play in 11 hours and 16 minutes. This had no overpowered gear and was just a really, really solid setup. It did, however, require extremely tight technical play in order to get down those Voidstone bosses. I don't think that most casual players could pick up Alex's build as it was after he'd killed the Maven and Uber Elder, and then go and beat those bosses with an exact copy of the character. You would need to get stronger gear, but it's definitely something that you can get stronger gear on, because it's not like Alex had anything particularly ridiculous on that character at all. The build that came in second place had by far the most powerful character that we saw in this race, and this was a Ball Lightning of Orbiting Archmage build. The player who ran it spent a lot of time farming Merciless Labyrinth in order to get their Ball Lightning of Orbiting gem. Of course, if you're playing in Trade League, you can circumvent that step. You can simply trade for that gem instead. It's probably going to cost you your first genuinely lucky drop, but you do know that you will get something lucky, even if it's not something that you can use yourself, and so that's something you can kind of count on having. Maybe it's a Divine Orb, maybe it's one of the unique items that's worth a lot more very early in the league than it is later on. Whatever the case, you'll have something that other people will want, and you should be able to get your hands on that Ball Lightning of Orbiting gem. Once you've got it, Archmage provides a bunch of boosts to you, but just fair warning if you try and copy Dan's character, he has a 6-link chest that's reasonably good, and he has an offhand wand that was the best item that I saw in the entirety of Jungroan's race event. This is not something that's amazing by late Trade League standards or anything like it, but it's something that you would not be able to get without the Necropolis mechanics in play. And then third place in that event was won by a Boneshatter Juggernaut, only 1 minute behind second place, and you'll be able to see MPM's character as it was at the end of that event, also linked in the description of this video. Now, one thing I want to continue to do is link 2, 3, and 4 Voidstone runs that look like they're interesting in some way. These don't need to be ones that are run as flawlessly as MPM, Alex, or Dan ran their 4 Voidstone race. Instead, it just needs to be things that have a solid level of power, enough that they can progress well through all of the Voidstone bosses, and that also have something interesting or unique about them. For example, I mentioned there'd be a Crackling Lance Archmage build, which is something that may or may not dodge patch notes and might get caught up in any nerfs that are taking place, targeting Ice Nova of Frostbolts versions of Archmage, and ends up being much worse next league. But whatever the case, in the 3.24 version of the game, these are solid builds that will work, and that means that if they survive the patch notes, they're ones that you could consider starting in 3.25 if the playstyle looks fun. Anyways, I want to leave it there, because in about 36 hours, we'll have a lot more information on which of these builds survive and which ones don't, and I'll try to remember to put together a video that summarizes which of these builds end up making the cut, and which ones are the ones that you should probably forget about if you were thinking of playing them. May your Varlorbs have interesting results.